Seoul never truly slept. Even at 3 in the morning, the city pulsed with neon lights, distant sirens, and the quiet murmur of millions of lives moving through the night. But beneath the glowing skyline, there existed another world, a hidden kingdom ruled by crime, power, and fear. In this underworld, power didn't come from money alone, it came from the lotus. From the blue neon glow that marked the boundaries of a man's territory, a symbol so absolute that even the police lights seemed to dim when they crossed into its shadows. And in that underworld, there was a name that sat above all others, a name that represented the very law of the shadows, Kang Jae-hoon. He stood in the center of a narrow hanok alleyway, his tailored black suit untouched by the monsoon rain that hammered the ancient stone tiles. Behind him, the massive blue neon lotus hummed with an electric vibration, casting a ghostly, saint-like halo around his head. Above, on the curved roofs of the traditional houses, his shadow guards were mere silhouettes against the dark sky, their blades catching the flickering red light of distant signs. For 10 years, this had been the order of things. Jae-hoon was the center of the universe, the man who had turned the chaotic violence of Seoul into a silent, profitable machine. He felt the weight of the city's heart beating in time with his own, a god of wet asphalt and cold iron. Then, the hum of the neon lotus skipped a beat. The silence that followed wasn't the usual quiet of respect. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness of a tomb. Jae-hoon didn't turn around when the first shadow shifted on the roof. He didn't have to. The betrayal didn't come with a shout, but with the sickeningly familiar whistle of steel cutting through the rain. Suddenly, the silhouettes he had trained to protect him converged like starving crows. The air was filled with the metallic scent of blood as the guards nearest to him were struck down by their own brothers. A blade grazed Jae-hoon's shoulder, tearing through the expensive wool of his suit. He spun, drawing his suppressed pistol in a blur of motion, but the sheer weight of the ambush was overwhelming. The blue neon lotus behind him shattered under a hail of gunfire, showering the alley in sparks and glass. Without the light, the world turned into a nightmare of shifting grays. A heavy boot caught Jae-hoon in the chest, sending him sprawling. He reached for the ledge of a stone wall, but his fingers slipped on the slick moss. The king of the underworld fell. He tumbled from the elevated walkway, crashing through a wooden fence and landing hard in the freezing mud of the lower slums. As he looked up through the crimson-stained rain, he saw the flickering remains of his halo die out. The shadows on the roofs didn't follow him down. They simply watched, knowing the fall was deep enough to kill a man. But as Jae-hoon's world went black, his fingers clawed into the filth, clinging to the only thing he had left, a cold, silent rage. The cold did not bite as hard as the shame. Kang Jae-hoon sat motionless, his back pressed against a damp brick wall that smelled of rot and rusted iron. He was deep within the labyrinthine gut of Jongno, a place where the city's discarded lives collected like silt. Above, the sky was a bruised purple, reflecting the jagged, neon-red glow of the new regime. The blue light was gone, replaced by a feverish crimson that stained every raindrop and puddle in the alley. He was a ghost now, haunting the ruins of his own kingdom. A tattered, grease-stained poncho hung over his shoulders, concealing the tattered remnants of the suit that had once signaled his absolute authority. A low-brimmed hat, heavy with rainwater, shielded his eyes from the flickering surveillance drones that buzzed like angry hornets overhead. Beneath the brim, his jaw was set in a hard, jagged line. His hands, the instruments of his trade, were wrapped in dirty, blood-spotted bandages, not just to heal the fractures from his fall, but to hide the tremors of a man who had nearly died. From his position in the shadows, he watched the world change. The Council of Seven had wasted no time. Every few minutes, a sleek black sedan would roll past the mouth of the alley, its windows tinted, escorted by motorcycles carrying men in tactical gear. They didn't wear the traditional silken robes of the Shadow Guard. They wore Kevlar and carried submachine guns. The elegance of the Lotus had been traded for the crude brutality of a street war. A group of younger gang members, wearing the red armbands of the New Order, stopped at a nearby noodle stall. They laughed loudly, kicking over a crate of glass bottles that shattered near Jae-hoon's feet. He didn't flinch. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply watched, memorizing their faces, their movements, and the way they held their guns. The underworld believed Kang Jae-hoon was a memory, a legend buried under the mud of the Hanok village. They saw only a broken beggar huddled amongst the trash. They did not see the predator calculating the distance to their throats. They did not notice the way the rain seemed to avoid him, or how the darkness curled around him like a loyal hound. He was no longer the king on the throne. He was the shadow in the corner, waiting for the red lights to dim. The city had forgotten that, before the lotus could bloom in the light, its roots had to thrive in the filth. Jae-hoon was merely returning to the soil. The basement of the old tea house was a tomb of forgotten things, a subterranean sanctuary buried beneath layers of dust and the heavy scent of damp cedar. Kang Jae-hoon moved through the dark with the muscle memory of a man who had built his own world from nothing. His bandaged hands traced the rough grain of a structural pillar until they found the knot. With a sharp, rhythmic click, a false floorboard groaned open, exhaling the cold, metallic breath of high-grade oil and preserved steel. Inside lay the needle, a sleek, customized suppressed pistol that had served as his scepter for a decade. Beside it, tucked into velvet-lined slots, were 3 blue metal coins, each engraved with the lotus that had once been the city's only law. He picked up the weapon, the weight settling into his palm like a long-lost friend returning from the dead. There was no joy in the reunion, only the grim satisfaction of a master craftsman reclaiming his tools. He checked the action. The slide moved with a silent, buttery glide that whispered of impending endings. Jae-hoon laid out a map of the city on the dust-covered floor, the ink illuminated by the flick of a cheap lighter. His gaze settled on the first petal, Kim Sang-jun. Once a low-level accountant with a stutter and a flair for logistics, Sang-jun was now the council's financier, presiding over a high-rise office in the Mapo district that bled the city's small businesses dry. He was the weakest link in the chain, a man who had traded his soul for a view of the river and a security detail that relied on cameras rather than instinct. Jae-hoon didn't feel anger as he loaded a fresh magazine into the needle. Anger was loud. It was the mark of an amateur. Instead, he felt a cooling of the blood, a sharpening of the senses that had been dulled by years of comfortable rule. He tucked the pistol into the waistband of his trousers and pulled the tattered poncho tight. He was no longer the king who commanded from the lights. He was the ghost who hunted from the shadows. Outside, the rain continued to wash the neon filth of the city into the drains. Jae-hoon stepped into the downpour, his low-brimmed hat casting a shadow over his eyes. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, a lonely sound in a city that had forgotten how to feel safe. He moved with a predatory grace that the slums hadn't seen in a generation, blending into the dark as if he were part of the very architecture. The Council of Seven believed they had inherited the earth. They were wrong. They had only inherited the debt, and tonight the first payment was due. The needle was out and the harvest had begun. The Hanok village was a sea of obsidian waves under the moonlight, the curved gables of the traditional roofs rising and falling like the scales of a sleeping dragon. Rain-slicked and treacherous, the tiles offered no room for error. Kang Jae-hoon moved across them with a silence that defied the elements, a shadow gliding over shadows. He was back where his fall had begun, but the perspective had shifted. He was no longer looking down from the heights, he was hunting through the rafters. Suddenly, the air behind him displaced, a subtle change in the rhythm of the wind. Jae-hoon threw himself forward, a silver blade whistling through the space his neck had occupied a microsecond before. He rolled across the wet ceramic tiles, the grit of the rain stinging his eyes, and came up in a crouch. Standing 5 yards away was a silhouette that mirrored his own posture. It was one of the shadow guards, a man Jae-hoon had personally drilled in the art of the invisible strike. The guard moved with terrifying fluidness, leaping from one roof ridge to another. Jae-hoon fired the needle, the suppressed cough of the weapon swallowed by a distant roll of thunder. The guard twisted in midair, a feat of acrobatic grace that Jae-hoon himself had perfected, and landed on a lower eave. This was the curse of his own excellence. He was fighting his own ghost, a student who knew every feint, every preferred angle, and every hidden rhythm of his master's combat style. They danced across the skyline, a frantic ballet of steel and lead. The guard lunged with a short sword, the blade singing as it cut through the downpour. Jae-hoon parried with the frame of his pistol, the jarring impact vibrating up his bandaged arms. He could see the guard's eyes beneath the hood, cold, focused, and entirely devoid of the loyalty that had once bound them. The council had not just stolen his throne, they had weaponized his legacy. Jae-hoon realized then that he could not win by playing his own game. To defeat the shadow, he had to become the void. As the guard prepared for a final, overhead strike, Jae-hoon didn't retreat. Instead, he dropped his weapon and stepped into the arc of the blade. It was a move of suicidal desperation that forced the guard to hesitate for a fraction of a heartbeat. That was all the king needed. He pivoted, using the guard's own momentum to hurl him over the edge of the roof. The sound of the fall was lost to the storm. Jae-hoon stood alone on the ridge, his lungs burning with the freezing air. He looked down at his trembling, bandaged hands. He had survived his own techniques, but the realization was bitter. The men on these roofs were his children, his creations. To reclaim his kingdom, he would have to dismantle them piece by piece, proving that while he had taught them how to kill, he had never taught them how to survive a man who had nothing left to lose. He retrieved the needle and vanished into the fog, the apex predator once more. The neon pulse of the city felt different from inside the Namdaemun electronics market, a subterranean hive of flickering wires, humming servers, and men who sold secrets by the gigabyte. Kang Jae-hoon moved through the narrow aisles, his tattered poncho brushing against stacks of salvaged motherboards. The air here was thick with the smell of ozone and cheap tobacco, a stark contrast to the sterile, rain-washed heights he once inhabited. He stopped before a stall draped in heavy black plastic, where a man known only as the broker sat encased in the cold blue light of a dozen mismatched monitors. The broker didn't look up. He was a creature of data, his fingers dancing across a mechanical keyboard with a rhythmic skeletal clatter. He dealt in the only currency that still mattered in Seoul, leverage. Jae-hoon didn't speak. He reached into his pocket and placed a single blue metal LOTUS coin on the desk. The clattering stopped instantly. The broker's eyes shifted, reflecting the iconic symbol. It was a ghost's currency, a token from a dead man that still held the power to collapse bank accounts and erase identities. Jae-hoon leaned into the dim light, his voice a low, sandpaper rasp. He didn't ask for loyalty, he dictated a reality. He handed over a small encrypted drive containing the private ledger of the first petal he had clipped, the financier Sangjun. It wasn't just a record of theft, it was evidence of a secret side deal with a rival triad, a betrayal within the betrayal. Jae-hoon instructed the broker to leak the data, but not to the authorities. He wanted it sent to the most paranoid member of the council, Park Jin-young, the man in charge of the council's security. Within the hour, the digital poison began to circulate through the underworld's private channels. Jae-hoon watched from the shadows of the stall as the monitors shifted from static to frantic communication logs. The council's united front was a facade, a fragile alliance held together by greed and a shared fear of a man they thought was dead. By feeding that fear with carefully curated lies, Jae-hoon was turning their own survival instincts into a weapon. The broker watched the data packets fly, a small, nervous smile playing on his lips. He understood the game. The council members were no longer hunting a ghost, they were hunting each other. Orders were being countermanded. Security details were being doubled. The red neon of the new order was beginning to flicker, troubled by internal static. Jae-hoon turned away from the blue glow of the monitors and merged back into the crowded market. He had sown the seeds of discord in the fertile soil of their ambition. Now, he only had to wait for the harvest of blood. The king didn't need an army to reclaim his throne. He only needed his enemies to forget who the real threat was until it was far too late. The Vanta Club was a cavernous cathedral of synthetic sin, vibrating with a bass line that felt like a slow-motion earthquake. High above the dancing masses, the VIP lounges were bathed in a violent strobe of electric blue and predatory crimson, the colors of a kingdom in transition. Tonight, 2 more petals of the council had gathered here to discuss the digital rot spreading through their ranks. They sat surrounded by walls of glass and a small army of mercenaries, unaware that the air they breathed had already been promised to the grave. Kang Jae-hoon entered not through the front, but through the sensory overload itself. He had discarded the tattered poncho, appearing once more in a sharp, charcoal-black suit that absorbed the neon glare. To the drug-fueled crowd, he was just another wealthy ghost. To the trained eye, he was a predator moving through high grass. He didn't use the elevators. He ascended through the service corridors, moving with a terrifying, rhythmic speed that left the security feeds trailing behind him like a slow dream. The hit began at the peak of the drop. As the music reached a deafening crescendo, Jae-hoon stepped onto the mezzanine. The first guard didn't even have time to reach for his holster before the needle coughed twice. The man slumped into the shadows, his fall masked by the strobing lights. Jae-hoon moved with a surgical grace that made the chaos look choreographed. He was a blur of motion, weaving through the panicked VIPs as the council's lieutenants realized the ghost had finally come for his tithe. The glass walls shattered outward, a glittering rain of diamonds falling onto the dance floor below. In the center of the carnage, Jae-hoon was a study in absolute stillness amidst the storm. He didn't waste bullets, he traded them for lives. When a mercenary lunged with a combat knife, Jae-hoon caught the man's wrist, redirected the blade into the throat of a second attacker, and fired a single shot over his shoulder without looking. It was the apex of his lethality, a masterclass in the violence he had spent a lifetime perfecting. By the time the sirens began to wail outside, the lounge was a silent tomb of velvet and broken glass. The two council members lay amidst the wreckage of their ambition, their eyes wide with the realization that the man they had discarded was not a myth, but a reckoning. Jae-hoon stood at the edge of the shattered balcony, the freezing night air rushing in to clear the scent of cordite. He adjusted his cufflinks with steady, bloodless hands. Below, the neon lights of Seoul continued to pulse, but the crimson was fading, overshadowed by a cold, familiar blue. He had proven that he wasn't just a ruler. He was the apex predator of this concrete jungle, and the hunt was far from over. The gates of the Lotus Tower stood like the monoliths of a modern fortress, guarded by layers of biometric scanners and men who moved with the stiff, nervous energy of those who knew they were being hunted. At the center of the perimeter, bathed in the harsh, artificial white of high-intensity security floodlights, Kang Jae-hoon walked out from the rain. He did not creep through the shadows or scale the walls. He walked down the center of the boulevard, his hands raised, his palms open to the cameras. The response was instantaneous. A dozen red laser dots converged on his chest, dancing like fireflies over his charcoal suit. Shadow guards dropped from the overhangs, their boots thudding against the wet asphalt as they surrounded him with leveled weapons. Jae-hoon remained a pillar of absolute calm. Even as the cold steel of a rifle barrel was pressed against the base of his skull, his expression did not flicker. He was no longer a ghost. He was a prisoner by choice. "Tell the council," Jae-hoon said, his voice cutting through the hiss of the rain with the authority of a man still wearing a crown, "that the king has come to collect his debt." They stripped him of the needle and bound his wrists with heavy-duty zip ties that bit into the scars of his previous life. He was pushed and prodded through the reinforced steel airlocks, deep into the belly of the tower he had designed to be impenetrable. To the guards, this was a victory, the legendary Lotus finally broken, brought to his knees before the new masters. They did not see the way Jae-hoon's eyes cataloged the refresh rates of the security monitors, the shifting patterns of the guard rotations, and the structural weaknesses of the internal elevators. The elevator ride to the penthouse was a silent ascent through the heart of his enemy's power. As the floor numbers climbed, the air grew colder, pressurized by the ego of the traitors above. Jae-hoon felt the familiar vibration of the building, a machine he knew better than his own heartbeat. The Council of Seven believed that by bringing him inside, they had finally ended the threat. They believed that a man in chains was a man defeated. They had forgotten the most basic rule of the game he had taught them. A cage is only a prison if you are the one inside it. As the doors chimed and opened to reveal the panoramic glass of the summit, Jae-hoon looked at the remaining members of the council and smiled. He had allowed them to pull the Trojan horse through their gates. He wasn't trapped in the Lotus Tower with them. They were trapped in the sky with him, and the locks only worked from the inside. The king's gambit was complete. Now the execution could begin. The zip ties snapped with a sharp, surgical pop. Kang Jae-hoon didn't wait for the guards to register the sound. He was already a blur of kinetic motion. Before the first man could level his rifle, Jae-hoon's bandaged hand drove the jagged plastic remains into the guard's carotid artery. He caught the falling weapon, spun, and fired a 3-round burst into the chest of the second man. The silence of the penthouse lobby died, replaced by the rhythmic, mechanical pulse of war. The ascent began not in the elevator, but in the fire stairs. Jae-hoon knew every inch of this concrete spine. On the 45th floor, he met the first wave of the Shadow Guard. These were men who moved with his own cadence, using the very breathing techniques he had taught them to remain calm in the face of death. He met them in the narrow corridor, where the flickering overhead lights strobed against the blood-spattered walls. It was a brutal, intimate choreography. Jae-hoon disarmed a swordsman with a flick of his wrist, using the stolen blade to parry a knife thrust from a second attacker. He didn't fight like a man seeking victory. He fought like a force of nature reclaiming its path. "You taught us that emotion is a weakness, Master," the lead guard hissed, blood bubbling from a wound in his side. Jae-hoon didn't answer with words. He stepped into the man's guard, delivering a palm strike that shattered a ribcage. "I also taught you," Jae-hoon finally rasped, his voice a low vibration against the roar of the building's alarm sirens, "never to let your target get this close." Floor by floor, the Lotus Tower became a vertical slaughterhouse. Jae-hoon moved through the tactical teams with a terrifying, rhythmic speed. He used the environment as a weapon, shattering glass partitions to create a hailstorm of distractions, triggering fire suppression systems to blind thermal optics with freezing mist. He was a ghost in the machine, a phantom who knew where the blind spots were because he had designed them. The council's desperate orders crackled over the radio units of the fallen. They were screaming for reinforcements, for barricades, for anything to stop the rising tide of the man they had thought was a myth. But there was no stopping the ascension. Jae-hoon was no longer feeling the fractures in his hands or the fatigue in his lungs. He was fueled by a cold, absolute clarity. With every life he took, he was erasing a piece of the empire he had built, purging the rot he had allowed to fester. By the time he reached the final reinforced door leading to the summit, the white marble of the stairwell was stained a deep, permanent crimson. He stood before the threshold of the penthouse, the king at the gates of his own ruined castle, ready to face the final treachery. The reinforced doors to the penthouse didn't groan. They yielded with a silent, heavy finality. Inside, the air was still, filtered of the city's smog and the iron tang of the stairwell's carnage. Behind the massive panoramic glass, Seoul stretched out like a carpet of dying embers, but the room's only true light came from the icon of his former life, the massive blue neon lotus mounted behind the mahogany desk. It hummed with a low, electric vibrato, casting a saintly, sapphire glow over the man who waited in Jae-hoon's chair. Min-ho, his protégé and the architect of the coup, sat in the shadows of the high-backed leather. He didn't look like a king. He looked like a child wearing a dead man's armor. Between them on the desk sat a single blue metal coin. "You should have stayed in the mud, Master," Min-ho said, his voice trembling despite the pistol leveled at Jae-hoon's chest. "The world moved on. We wanted a future that didn't require your permission." Jae-hoon didn't stop walking. He ignored the red laser dot dancing over his heart. "A future built on a lie is just a longer way to die," he replied, his voice a gravelly whisper that seemed to command the very air in the room. The duel was over before the first casing hit the floor. Min-ho fired, but Jae-hoon was already a ghost in motion, a blur of charcoal wool and lethal intent. He didn't use a gun. He closed the distance with a terrifying, rhythmic speed, his bandaged hands moving like striking cobras. He parried the gun arm, the bones snapping with a sickening crack, and drove his palm into Min-ho's chest. The younger man collapsed back into the chair, the air leaving his lungs in a ragged gasp. Jae-hoon stood over him, the blue neon lotus framing his head like a crown of cold fire. He picked up the metal coin from the desk, looking at his own reflection in its polished surface. He saw a man who had ruled through fear and been repaid in kind. He saw the rot he had created. Slowly, he reached behind the desk and gripped the heavy power cables that fed the lotus its life. With a surge of strength, he tore them free. Sparks erupted in a violent, cascading waterfall, the blue light flickering and dying as the high-voltage current surged into the room's electronics. Jae-hoon didn't move as the fire began to catch on the heavy velvet curtains and the stacks of ledgers. He took a lighter from the desk, flicked it, and dropped the flame into a pool of spilled liquor. As the penthouse transformed into a furnace of orange and gold, Jae-hoon walked toward the balcony. Behind him, the symbol of his reign was melting into a puddle of glass and blue slag. He stepped out into the freezing rain, the heat of the burning empire at his back. He didn't look back at the throne. The king was gone, and the ghost was finally at peace. In the distance, the city lights of Seoul continued to pulse, but for the first time in 10 years, they belonged to no one.